For many people in eastern Poland, the first Soviet tanks were supposed to mean the end of terror. Instead, within months, it would become clear that one occupier was being replaced by another, and that the underground army which had fought for an independent Poland now stood in the way of the new order. In early January 1944, as the snow lay hard across the fields near Rokitno, the Red Army crossed the pre-war frontier and pushed into territory that, before 1939, had been the eastern half of the Polish Republic. On Soviet maps, it was something different. Land already absorbed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics after the German-Soviet Pact. Land they believed they were simply retaking. The difference between those two ways of seeing the same villages and towns would shape everything that followed. On paper, the Home Army and the Soviets were fighting the same enemy. For years, Armia Krajowa cells had reported German troop movements, sabotaged railway lines, and prepared for the moment when the occupiers would crack. Now that moment seemed to be at hand. Local AK commanders were instructed to make contact with Soviet units where possible, to coordinate attacks against retreating German forces, and to show that a Polish underground state still existed beneath the rubble. In the first weeks, there were genuine instances of cooperation. AK guides led Soviet inspection through familiar forests. Polish liaison officers provided intelligence on German strongpoints, depots, and minefields. To many in the underground, it was a chance to prove that Poland had not died in 1939, that its clandestine army could stand alongside a great power in the final act of liberation. But even in these early encounters, small signs hinted that the alliance was fragile. From Moscow's perspective, the Home Army represented something deeply problematic. Its commanders swore loyalty to a government in exile in London, which the Soviets regarded as bourgeois and unreliable. Its officers were shaped by pre-war traditions, hostile both to Nazism and to communism. Reports flowing back to the NKVD and to the Red Army's political officers described the AK as a nationalist force, rooted in landowners, officers, clergy, and middle-class intellectuals, exactly the strata a future communist Poland would need to neutralize. As Soviet fronts advanced through Volhynia, Polizy, and into the Vilnius and Lwów regions, this conflict of visions began to harden into policy. SMERSH, the Red Army's military counterintelligence, moved with the spearheads, tasked not only with hunting German agents, but also with categorizing and infiltrating any non-Soviet armed group they encountered. For SMERSH officers, an armed unit that did not take orders from Moscow could not remain independent for long. In some places, misunderstandings were painfully simple. AK units emerging from the forests, expecting to attach themselves as assistants to the advancing Soviet divisions, were ordered to disarm for the duration of joint operations. Polish officers invited to coordination meetings found themselves carefully questioned about their command networks, communications, and political links. At first, many assumed this was standard wartime procedure, another layer of suspicion in a conflict full of betrayals. But in Vilnius and around Lwów, the pattern grew darker. AK detachments that had fought against German garrisons suddenly saw their officers taken aside by NKVD men for verification. Some never returned. Rank-and-file soldiers were marched to improvised camps on the outskirts of towns, their weapons collected and their names taken down in lists. According to Soviet terminology, this was filtration, a way to separate genuine resistance fighters from alleged collaborators and spies. To those behind the barbed wire, it felt like the beginning of something else. The political backdrop was shifting just as quickly. On 22 July 1944, while the front lines still ran through central Poland, a new body announced itself from the city of Lublin, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, known by its Polish initials as the Polish Committee of National Liberation. Presented as a provisional government, the committee was in reality assembled under Soviet supervision, drawing heavily on Polish communists who had survived earlier purges and on figures willing to work within a framework dictated by Moscow. For the Home Army, this was a warning siren. The underground state had its own delegation, courts, police, and administration, all secret but rooted in pre-war legality. Now, in territory under Soviet control, a rival authority claimed to represent Poland. Polish Committee of National Liberation decrees promised land reform, social justice, and retribution against collaborators, and they were backed by the power of the Red Army and the NKVD. If the Polish Committee of National Liberation was the skeleton of a new Poland, there was little room in it for an independent AK. On the ground, the atmosphere grew tense. Some Polish commanders, weighing their options, considered whether to uncover their units and accept incorporation into formations loyal to the emerging communist government. Others insisted on holding their structures in reserve, waiting for instructions from London and hoping that the Western Allies would insist on genuine sovereignty for post-war Poland. Meanwhile, NKVD and SMERSH officers compiled files on both groups, trying to determine who could be turned and who should be removed. The contradictions played out in small, human gestures. In a village outside Białystok, a Soviet officer might share bread and cigarettes with an AK partisan, swapping stories about German ambushes and narrow escapes. Yet behind them, an NKVD man quietly noted down the names, addresses, and former ranks mentioned in conversation. For the soldiers, the war against Germany still overshadowed everything. For the security services, the next war, the political struggle for Poland's future, was already underway. By mid-1944, the illusion that the Home Army could simply step out of the shadows, fight alongside the Soviets, and then hand the country back to a non-communist government was beginning to break down. Each encounter with NKVD interrogators, each unexpected arrest of a regional commander, sent a message up the underground's chain of command. Armed strength made the AK visible, and visibility made it vulnerable. The question was no longer whether tension existed between two supposed allies, but how far the Soviets were prepared to go to remove a rival. As Soviet columns rolled further west, toward the cities that had been written and rewritten on maps since 1939, the pattern was set: cooperation on the battlefield, followed by disarmament and control once the front had moved on. And in the streets and backrooms of one city in particular, Vilnius, this fragile bargain between liberator and underground, would be pushed to its breaking point. The capture of Vilnius in July 1944 began as a shared objective. For the Home Army, it was a chance to prove that an independent Poland still had the strength to liberate its own historic cities. For the Soviets, it was a step toward securing their western flank as they pushed deeper into German-held territory. Yet as Polish and Soviet fighters advanced side by side through the outskirts, a moment of triumph was already turning into a test of trust that neither side would pass. Operation Ostra Brama had been planned for months within the AK's regional command. The idea was simple in theory and agonizingly complex in practice. Rise against the German garrison just as the Red Army approached, seize the city, and greet the Soviets as the legitimate representatives of the Polish state. Units from Wilno and Nowogródek districts prepared to strike, counting on speed and local knowledge to offset their lack of heavy weapons. When Soviet scouting elements appeared east of the city, many believed the timing had finally aligned. In the early days of July, Home Army formations moved into action. Small detachments attacked German checkpoints, cut communications, and attempted to open corridors into the city. As the battle intensified, Soviet units joined the assault, bringing armor and artillery that the Poles lacked. Together, they forced the remaining German defenders to pull back toward the center. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the old Polish-Soviet hostility might be set aside by the urgency of defeating a common enemy. Polish commanders took a calculated risk during these operations. To coordinate effectively, they revealed their strength units that had operated in secrecy for years, stepped into the perfect, open, often wearing improvised armbands or pre-war insignia. Communications officers surfaced with radios, Couriers moved freely between strongpoints, and officers met Soviet staff to negotiate attack routes. In those hours, the underground came into full daylight, visible not only to Allies, but to Soviet counterintelligence watching from the sidelines. When the Germans finally abandoned the last defensive line and the smoke began to lift over Vilnius, the nature of the operation shifted. Instead of celebrating a joint victory, AK officers were informed that Soviet commanders wished to discuss further cooperation. Meeting points were designated in farmhouses, school buildings, and commandeered offices on the city's edges. Many Poles arrived believing they were negotiating the city's administration or planning continued action against German remnants. Instead, they walked into rooms staffed by NKVD officers who had come with different instructions. Archival accounts describe these encounters in similar patterns. Polish officers were welcomed politely, offered seats, and asked to recount their unit strengths, supply conditions, and communication channels. The tone was formal but calm. Then, almost without transition, the questioning shifted to political affiliations, links to the exile government, and the chain of command stretching back to London. Once the interrogators were satisfied, the officer was told he would need to clarify his status and was escorted out straight into detention. Across the region, disarmament orders spread quickly. Soviet units surrounded AK camps or demanded the surrender of weapons, pending integration into a joint command. Soldiers were marched in small groups to makeshift collection points where rifles, pistols, and grenades were stacked in piles. Those who complied often assumed this was temporary. Those who hesitated were accused of hiding arms or obstructing operations. By the second week of July, most home army units in the Vilnius area had been rendered incapable of independent action. Transit camps appeared almost overnight. Fields on the outskirts of the city, barns, schoolyards, and abandoned guards and barbed wire surrounded depots. Inside, men were sorted according to hastily assembled lists. NKVD filtration teams used questionnaires to determine whether a soldier would be released, conscripted into Soviet-controlled units, or transported east. Some were accused of links to nationalist organizations. Others were held simply because they were officers in an unrecognized army. Polish accounts speak of thousands detained. Soviet documents suggest lower numbers. The true total remains contested, shifted by incomplete records and differing definitions of who counted as an AK member. What is certain is that the arrests reached deeply into the underground structure, removing seasoned commanders and breaking networks built over years. Many of those taken from Vilnius disappeared into camps across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, their families learning only months later that they had been evacuated for further processing. The psychological impact on the Home Army was immediate and severe. Word of the arrests spread rapidly through the underground's couriers. Regional commanders who had considered future cooperation with the Soviets now questioned whether any such relationship was possible. In Warsaw, where thoughts of rising against the Germans were gathering momentum, the Vilnius events became a warning. If Soviet security services treated AK units this way in one liberated city, what might they do in the capital? In the forests south of the city, scattered groups of AK soldiers tried to regroup, unsure whether to hide their weapons, attempt to escape westward, or present themselves in hopes of release. But by then, NKVD units had established checkpoints on all major roads, and SMERSH detachments were combing villages for anyone connected to the underground. The Red Army's military victory had opened the door to a political confrontation the Poles could not win on the battlefield. Among the Soviet officers overseeing the operation was General Ivan Serov, whose reports to Moscow described the Home Army as a threat to post-war stability and recommended firm action. His presence signaled that the arrests were not the result of local misunderstandings, but part of a deliberate strategy. The underground, which had survived German repression, was now being dismantled by an ally whose long-term goals were incompatible with its existence. By late July, as the front moved away from Vilnius and deeper into central Poland, The city stood as a sign of what awaited other AK districts. Cooperation had turned into captivity, and the space for negotiation was shrinking. The shockwaves from this betrayal spread along courier lines and through the chains of command, reaching Warsaw at the very moment its leaders were preparing a desperate bid to claim their own capital before the Soviets arrived. When Warsaw rose against German occupation on the afternoon of 1 August 1944, its defenders hoped to achieve in the capital what had failed in Vilnius, a clear, undeniable act of Polish liberation that would greet the approaching Red Army with an accomplished fact. For the Home Army, the uprising was both a military gamble and a political declaration that Poland would not be handed over without its people asserting their own authority. Yet as the city fought street by street, the Soviet advance on the eastern bank of the Vistula slowed, then stopped, leaving Warsaw's fighters alone in the ruins. The uprising had been debated for months within the underground command. Some officers warned that the moment was too soon, the weapons too few, the risk too great. Others argued that delaying would allow the Soviets and their newly installed Polish Committee of National Liberation Administration to claim the city without resistance. The stakes were more than symbolic. Warsaw was the nation's political heart, the seat of the secret Polish state, and the clearest stage on which the existence of a non-communist Poland could be demonstrated to the world. When the order finally came, the opening hours were chaotic and hopeful. Young couriers sprinted through the streets delivering mobilization messages. Barricades sprang up from paving stones and overturned trams. German garrisons, caught off guard, fell back from several districts. The Home Army unveiled weapons, stockpiles long hidden beneath floorboards and in cemetery vaults. Flags appeared from balconies for the first time since 1939, and for a brief moment, the city's divisions seemed to dissolve under a shared sense of purpose. But from the start, the uprising carried within it the seeds of crisis. German response forces regrouped quickly, supported by armor and artillery. Communications within the AK were fragile. Ammunition ran dangerously low within days. And across the river, where the Red Army had reached the eastern suburbs, the offensive faltered. Official Soviet announcements cited exhausted troops and overstretched supply lines. Reports from Western diplomats suggested a more complex picture. Stalin may have viewed the destruction of the non-communist underground as strategically advantageous. Whatever the combination of motives, the result was decisive. While Soviet surveillance watched from Praga, the Germans encircled district after district. The Poles fought with improvised weapons, captured arms, and relentless determination. But by September, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Civilians crowded into cellars to escape the bombardment, and the underground leadership faced the impossible choice of continuing a doomed stand or negotiating surrender to prevent further destruction. When the fighting finally ended on 2 October 1944, the city lay devastated. Tens of thousands of civilians were driven from their homes, and the remaining fighters were marched into captivity. Yet even in defeat, the Home Army believed it had shown the world that Poland did not collapse silently. What its surviving members could not yet know was that the worst threat to their independence would come not from the Germans, but from the forces that claimed to be liberating the country. As German units withdrew westward, underground cells tried to reorganize. Couriers who had hidden radio sets in basements or beneath chapel floors surfaced again, hoping to re-establish lines of communication with districts that had not risen. But the vacuum left by the Germans was filled quickly. NKVD and SMERSH detachments crossed the Vistula, entering the shattered city with lists, dossiers, and directives prepared in advance. Their mission was not to help rebuild Warsaw, it was to neutralize the underground network before it could reconstitute itself. The first to be targeted were liaison officers and communications specialists. These were the people who stitched the underground together. Radio operators who knew the frequencies used to reach London, couriers familiar with safe houses, clerks who had kept coded records of district commanders. To Soviet security services, They were not simply veterans, they were the infrastructure of a political rival. Arrests followed swiftly, often conducted with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized operations in Vilnius. Next came the screening of broader formations. Crowded into makeshift transit points, such as the Pruszków camp, thousands of civilians and AK soldiers were processed by a combination of Soviet and newly formed Polish communist officials. Individuals were questioned about their wartime activities, affiliations, and loyalties. Some were released after being deemed harmless. Others were separated for further verification. Those with known or suspected underground ties faced the likelihood of conscription into the Soviet-backed Polish units being formed, or transportation eastward for filtration. For many AK veterans, the treatment came as a shock. The uprising had been intended as a gesture of solidarity with the Allied cause, a final effort to liberate Polish soil before outside powers dictated its future. Instead, the defeat created conditions in which the NKVD could operate with almost complete discretion. In the rubble of Warsaw, there were no Western observers, no functioning local courts, and no institutions capable of pushing back against Soviet demands. The underground found itself stripped of its protective armor, its secrecy. At the same time, the political environment beyond Warsaw shifted rapidly. The Polish Committee of National Liberation, backed by Soviet authority, was expanding westward with administrative teams and security detachments. Its decrees declared the underground state illegal, and its propaganda framed the Home Army as radical, capitalist, or even collaborating with German forces. Although many Poles rejected these accusations, the information war laid the groundwork for the legal measures that followed. As winter approached, the surviving leadership of the Home Army faced a decision that would become a turning point. Some argued that the AK should formally dissolve to prevent further arrests and to avoid giving the Soviets a pretext for mass repression. Others believed that dissolution would amount to surrendering Poland's sovereignty without a fight. But behind every argument hung the shadow of Vilnius and the tightening grip of NKVD control. The Soviets now held Warsaw's fate and the fate of the underground state in their hands. By the end of 1944, the uprising had left more than a ruined city. It had created the perfect conditions for a political struggle in which the Home Army no longer held the initiative. The question was no longer whether the Soviets would move against the underground leadership, but when and on what pretext. And as winter deepened, an unexpected invitation would arrive, offering the promise of dialogue while masking a more calculated objective. In February 1945, as the front lines stabilized and the end of the European war came into sight, a message began circulating quietly through the surviving structures of the Polish underground state. Soviet authorities, it said, were prepared to meet. They wished to discuss the future administration of Poland, to reconcile misunderstandings, and to explore how the underground's representatives might participate in shaping the country's post-war life. After months of arrests, tensions, and broken promises, the offer seemed improbable, but it was delivered with the confidence of a power that now dominated Polish territory. For the underground's civilian and military leaders, the choice was stark: decline and risk being branded terrorists, or accept and hope for even a narrow chance at negotiation. The man most central to these talks was General Leopold Okulicki, known in the underground as Niedźwiadek, the final commander of the Home Army. Alongside him stood Jan Stanisław Jankowski, the government delegate, and other key figures representing the undercover ministries of justice, internal affairs, and foreign relations. Their mandate was twofold: protect what remained of Poland's legal continuity and avoid giving the Soviets a pretext to dismantle the underground entirely. Yet every one of them understood the danger. By early 1945, the NKVD had firmly established itself across Poland, operating transit prisons, filtration camps, and networks of informants. Inviting the underground to the table could easily be a prelude to some harsher move. The initial meetings were staged in a manner that blended fellowship with calculated ambiguity. Soviet officers presented themselves as intermediaries, fluent in diplomatic language, eager to settle all misunderstandings. They praised the underground sacrifices and emphasized that a united front against the remnants of German occupation was still necessary. But beneath that friendly surface, the pattern was familiar. Questions about command structures, requests for written summaries of organizational responsibilities, and repeated insistence that representatives travel to a secure location where senior Soviet officials could meet them in person. Those locations, first in Pruszków, then in the town of Marki near Warsaw, were chosen by the Soviets, controlled by the Soviets, and isolated from any meaningful oversight. When the Polish delegates arrived, they found only Soviet officers waiting. There were no Allied observers, no neutral intermediaries, no Polish officials from the London government. Still, the underground leaders pressed forward. They argued for legal continuity, for the inclusion of non-communist parties in any provisional government, and for recognition of the immense sacrifices Poles had made under both German and Soviet rule. What they did not know was that NKVD units had already prepared transport and arrest teams. According to later reports, the operation was coordinated by General Ivan Serov, the same senior officer who had overseen the arrests in Vilnius. Orders instructed operatives to maintain the appearance of negotiations until every key delegate was in custody. The goal was not merely to capture individuals, but to decapitate the underground's political leadership in a single, decisive action. In March 1945, the trap closed. One by one, as the Polish representatives entered the meeting rooms, they were detained. Some were told they would be questioned briefly before the talks resumed. Others were informed that their travel documents needed verification. Within hours, the entire delegation, including Okulicki, Jankowski, and 14 other leaders, had been placed under NKVD guard and prepared for transport. They were driven not to a negotiating chamber, but to an airfield. From there, a Soviet plane carried them eastward, across a landscape still scarred by fighting, toward Moscow. The men had no illusions about what awaited them. Soviet justice, especially in political cases, followed predetermined lines. Yet, as representatives of the Polish underground state, they still believed they had a duty to speak to, affirm that Poland's legal institutions had never surrendered, that its underground had fought both totalitarian invaders, and that any future government should reflect the will of its people rather than the dictates of a foreign power. In Moscow, the arrests were quickly formalized. The men were taken to the Lubyanka and other detention centers, their belongings confiscated, interrogations conducted in long sessions that focused on their links to the London government and on their alleged anti-Soviet activities. Soviet prosecutors constructed a narrative that cast the underground as engaged in sabotage, terrorism, and conspiracy against the Red Army. The charges were political, but the format was legalistic, a performance designed for international consumption. The Western Allies were notified only after the fact. American and British embassies in Moscow made inquiries, expressing concern that leaders of a resistance movement that had fought against the Axis, alongside Allied intelligence networks, were now being held without explanation. Yet the geopolitical context overshadowed their protests. With Germany near collapse and the formation of post-war Europe at stake, neither London nor Washington was prepared to challenge Stalin directly over the fate of a small delegation from a country already within the Soviet sphere. In June 1945, after months of controlled isolation, the 16 Polish leaders were brought before a Soviet military court. The trial was heavily publicized, framed as fair and transparent, though the outcome was all but predetermined. One by one, the defendants heard the charges. Engaging in illegal military actions, maintaining contacts with foreign intelligence, sabotaging operations against Germany, and refusing to cooperate with Soviet authorities. Some, under pressure or calculation, admitted partial guilt, others denied the charges entirely. insisting they had fought only for an independent Poland. Sentences ranged from several years of imprisonment to time already served. Okulicki received a 10-year sentence. Jankowski, 8. A few were released shortly afterward, but most were sent to camps deep within the Soviet interior. Several would not survive their confinement. For the Home Army, still scattered across Poland, the trial was a crushing blow. Their political head had been severed, their leadership paraded before the world as criminals, and their hopes for a negotiated role in post-war Poland extinguished. Yet the Soviets understood that removing the underground's leaders was only one step. The structures, the loyalties, and the networks they had built still existed back home. And as the summer of 1945 began, a new phase of the struggle was taking shape, one that would combine communist political consolidation with a quiet but relentless campaign to hunt down the remnants of the Home Army across a shattered country. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Poland stood among the victors, but without the sovereignty it had fought for. The Red Army occupied almost all major cities. The Polish Committee of National Liberation had evolved into a provisional government aligned with Moscow, and the underground's political leadership was either dispersed or imprisoned after the Trial of the 16. Into this landscape stepped a new institution, the Ministry of Public Security, known by its Polish initials as the UB. Formed with Soviet guidance and staffed by veterans of communist circles that had survived wartime purges, it quickly became the central tool for shaping the political future of the country. The UB's foundations rested on a template already familiar in territories liberated by the Red Army. NKVD advisors worked directly with Polish recruits, offering training, investigative procedures, and institutional models. Their goal was to build a security apparatus capable of both eliminating potential enemies and ensuring that political developments followed a path acceptable to Moscow. Evidence shows that from the moment of its creation, the UB was designed not merely as a police force, but as an instrument of political consolidation. For former members of the Home Army, this transition marked a new phase of uncertainty. With the war against Germany over, many hoped they could demobilize quietly, return to civilian life, and wait for diplomatic negotiations to determine Poland's fate. But the UB viewed the underground's members, especially those with pre-war officer training or connections to the London government, as a reservoir of potential opposition. Their wartime service was less important than their political loyalty, which the new security services believed could not be guaranteed. Amnesty campaigns became one of the UB's most effective tools. In public statements, the new government promised leniency for AK members who came forward, registered, and pledged loyalty to the emerging state. Thousands responded, exhausted by years of covert life and believing that compliance might protect their families. Yet many discovered that these declarations were less acts of forgiveness than opportunities for identification. Registration lists provided the UB with detailed maps of underground networks, supply lines, and hierarchies. Some who registered were allowed to return home. Others were arrested weeks or months later on charges of hiding weapons, maintaining illegal contacts, or acting against the people's government. At the same time, the UB expanded its operations into the countryside. Small teams of agents, often accompanied by Soviet advisors, moved from village to village interviewing local officials, teachers, and clergy. Their questions focused on who had supported the Home Army, who might still be armed, and which former partisans retained influence among the population. In areas like Białystok, Lublin, and the Carpathian foothills, regions where AK units had long-standing ties, the UB's presence became a source of fear. Informants were recruited, surveillance networks established, and entire communities drawn into the slow, methodical dismantling of underground authority. As political consolidation advanced, the stakes grew. In 1946, the Provisional Government announced a national referendum to determine public support for key policy questions, including land reform, the future of the Senate, and national borders. Officially, the referendum, popularly known as the 3 Yes, was a democratic mechanism to measure the will of the people. In practice, it was the first major electoral event controlled by the UB. Reports from the time describe widespread intimidation, ballot tampering, and the suppression of opposition voices. Party loyalists staffed polling stations, anti-communist activists were arrested or harassed, and entire districts reported results that contradicted local testimony. When the official tally declared overwhelming support for the government's positions, few doubted that the outcome had been engineered. For the Home Army's veterans, these developments confirmed what many had feared. The political process was closing around them, and the structures of the underground, once the backbone of national resistance, were no longer seen as heroic but as obstacles to the new order. The UB pursued not only commanders but also couriers, printers, and civilians who had served as the backbone of logistics. Even small acts of wartime assistance to the AK could bring suspicion, yet repression did not go entirely unchallenged. In the forests and hills of eastern and southeastern Poland, groups of former AK soldiers formed self-defense units. Some aimed simply to survive. Others sought to resist what they saw as a new occupation. These bands, sometimes numbering in the dozens, sometimes only a handful, avoided direct confrontation, but targeted UB informant networks and refused to register under the new amnesty programs. The UB labeled them bandits, and local propaganda amplified this term, portraying them as criminals rather than remnants of the wartime resistance. As the summer of 1946 turned toward autumn, the UB intensified its pressure. Joint operations with Soviet advisors targeted the hideouts of underground remnants. Villages suspected of supporting former partisans were subjected to roundups. Arrests and interrogations, non-graphically described in surviving accounts, became a steady feature of daily life in regions where the Home Army had once held influence. The underground's last hopes for legal recognition faded as the new state tightened its grip. Behind these actions stood the broader geopolitical reality. By the end of 1946, Poland was firmly within the emerging Soviet sphere. Western influence, once a potential shield for underground activity, had receded. Diplomats in London and Washington voiced concerns about the erosion of civil liberties, but with post-war reconstruction and the onset of Cold War tensions absorbing their attention, little concrete support followed. The Home Army, once symbolically linked to the Allied cause, now found itself largely isolated. By late 1946, the contradiction was complete. The AK existed officially only as a dissolved organization. Yet, its members continued to shape the country's political landscape either through passive silence or through active resistance. And as 1947 approached, a final shift loomed. Elections were scheduled, resistance groups were weakening, and the UB's machinery had grown more efficient. The Home Army's dissolution would soon give way to the practical elimination of its last armed elements. But in the forests, where demobilized soldiers still carried the weight of unmet promises, the struggle was far from over. When 1947 dawned, the war had been over for almost 2 years. Yet for many former members of the Home Army, the conflict felt unresolved. The enemy had changed, the front lines had shifted, but the sense of fighting for Poland's independence, now in a different form, remained. These were the men and women who came to be known as the cursed soldiers, not because they embraced the name, but because they found themselves trapped between a vanished underground state and a new government that considered them enemies of the people. For some, the path into post-war resistance was not ideological but immediate and personal. Former partisans had spent years hidden in forests, moving at night, carrying arms out of necessity. When the war ended, many returned to villages that no longer resembled the homes they remembered. Families had moved or disappeared. Properties had changed hands, and relationships with local authorities were shaped by fear and uncertainty. Some who had surrendered under the 1945 amnesty later discovered that their former comrades had been arrested, fueling distrust of any promises issued by the new state. Others joined the post-war underground because they believed that Poland's fate was still unsettled. They watched the elections scheduled for early 1947 with little expectation of fairness. They knew about the referendum, manipulation of the previous year, the expansion of the UB, and the presence of Soviet advisors in local militia stations. For these men, resisting seemed less like a refusal to accept peace and more like a refusal to accept a version of peace imposed from outside. The geography of this resistance reflected long-standing wartime patterns. Forests across Podlasie, Lublin, Białystok, and the Carpathian foothills offered hiding places that partisans knew intimately. Small villages acted as unofficial supply points where sympathizers could provide food, clothing, or information. Communication depended on trusted couriers, often teenagers, who moved between settlements on foot or bicycle, carrying handwritten messages or verbal instructions. The aim was rarely to challenge the state directly. Instead, many groups focused on survival and on pushing back against the most intrusive actions of the UB. Within this fragmented landscape, a few commanders stood out. General August Emil Fieldorf, known as Nil, did not lead post-war armed operations, but his wartime reputation made him a symbolic figure for many still in hiding. Zygmunt Senzilas, Łupaszko, who had fought in the Vilnius region during the occupation, led units that continued to evade capture into the late 1940s. Hieronim Dekutowski, Zapora, active in the Lublin region, commanded cells that conducted defensive actions and refused to surrender despite mounting pressure. Their stories varied, but what united them was a belief that the underground still had a duty to protect civilians who were undeservedly drawn into the crossfire of political change. The response from the new Polish security apparatus was systematic. The UB, enhanced by Soviet advisors, launched coordinated operations to identify, isolate, and eliminate the remaining underground cells. They relied heavily on informants, using promises, threats, or arrests to gather intelligence. Units, disguised as partisan groups, conducted deceptive operations, presenting themselves as allies before arresting entire networks. Roadblocks appeared on forest edges. Surveillance intensified in market towns where underground couriers were known to pass through. The campaigns seldom involved large-scale battles. Instead, they revolved around patient tracking, infiltration, and psychological pressure. For the resistance, time was the enemy. The social landscape was shifting. The desperate poverty of the immediate post-war years began to lessen as Reconstruction advanced. Families pressured their sons and brothers to come out of hiding, fearing reprisals. The state's grip tightened, and the window in which armed resistance might influence national politics narrowed. Western governments, now focused on Reconstruction and the emerging contours of the Cold War, offered sympathy, but little else. The symbolic links the Home Army once had to Allied support no longer carried weight. By mid-1947, underground was fracturing. Some groups disbanded, concluding that continued struggle would bring nothing but further suffering. Others accepted amnesty, hoping the passage of time would heal divisions. A few chose exile, crossing borders in search of a life beyond surveillance. Those who stayed in the forests did so knowing the odds had turned decisively against them. Interrogation records, memoirs, and post-1989 rehabilitations portray these last months as a moment of exhaustion. Former partisans described living on the move, never staying more than a night in one place. They spoke of dwindling supplies, betrayals, and harsh winters endured under makeshift shelters. The purpose of resistance blurred as survival itself became a daily struggle. Through it all, the UB portrayed its campaign as restoring order to a nation emerging from chaos. Propaganda leaflets and posters claimed that bandits threatened the people's government and obstructed Reconstruction. Even in these statements, there was an unspoken recognition that the underground had not been defeated merely by force. It had also been worn down by isolation, fear, and the realization that the Poland it hoped to defend no longer had space for it. By the end of 1947, most armed groups had ceased to function. A few individuals would remain hidden for years. But the coordinated resistance that had once linked forests and villages across the east was largely gone. In its place was a quieter struggle, one waged not with rifles but with memory, silence, and the question that lingered after every arrest: what had all their sacrifice meant, and who would decide how it would be remembered? As the final embers of forest resistance faded, a new phase began, one in which the battle was no longer fought in the countryside, but in the narratives that shaped Poland's post-war identity, written by a government that sought to control the past as tightly as it controlled the present. When the last follower groups faded from the forests in the late 1940s, the struggle between the Home Army and the Soviet-backed state did not end. It simply changed its terrain. The battleground shifted from villages and hideouts to classrooms, newspapers, courtrooms, and archives. What had once been a clash over military and political authority became a contest over meaning, memory, and legitimacy, stretching across the entire Cold War and shaping the way generations of Poles understood their own past. By 1947, the new government had consolidated control over the country's institutions. With the UB now fully entrenched, the ruling party turned its attention to rewriting the narrative of the war and its aftermath. The Home Army, once widely seen as the backbone of Polish resistance, was cast in official discourse as reactionary, treacherous, or even fascist. This reframing served two purposes. It delegitimized former underground networks that still commanded respect among the population, and it justified the severe measures used against them in the preceding years. The first target of this policy was the historical record. Archives belonging to the pre-war government, underground structures, and church institutions were seized or restricted. Documents detailing AK operations, internal debates, and its cooperation with Allied intelligence were locked away. In their place, new accounts were produced that emphasized alleged Home Army complicity with German forces, claims that historians would later contest using broader evidence. The accusations were politically useful, however, and they became a staple of early post-war propaganda. Families of former AK members felt the consequences directly. Having a father, brother, or husband linked to the underground could lead to blocked career paths, police surveillance, or quiet but persistent discrimination. Teachers were instructed to avoid discussing the secret state in anything but negative terms. University students who asked too many questions risked attracting the attention of security services. A silence grew around the subject, not absolute but heavy enough that many learned to speak about the war only within trusted circles. Yet outside Poland, a different story took shape. Radio stations broadcasting from the West, émigré newspapers published in Paris and London, and memoirs written by Polish veterans offered competing narratives. In these accounts, the Home Army remained a symbol of patriotism and sacrifice, and the repression that followed was portrayed as the first major act of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. For listeners inside Poland who could tune in secretly, these broadcasts offered confirmation that their private memories were not isolated, that others, too, remembered the underground with respect. Within the country, small cracks in the official version began to appear after Stalin's death. The political thaw of 1956 brought a degree of liberalization, including limited rehabilitations of former underground members. Some were released from prison. Others had their wartime service quietly acknowledged. But the shift was incomplete. While the most extreme accusations faded, the state did not welcome full re-examination of the NKVD's early role or UB operations from the mid-1940s. Too many careers and institutions still rested on those foundations. Across the following decades, the image of the Home Army drifted between silence, suspicion, and subdued admiration. Monuments were rare and discreet. Public commemorations were minimal, yet memory persisted in private spaces, in family stories, in hidden wartime photographs, and in the guarded pride of communities that had sheltered underground fighters. Even state-approved history books, though stripped of nuance, could not erase the fundamental fact that the AK had fought the German occupation with extraordinary breadth and courage. The turning point came only at the end of the 1980s, when political transformations across Eastern Europe reopened long-sealed archives and swept aside the barriers that had kept certain histories in shadow. Former partisans who had survived into old age finally spoke publicly about their experiences. Historians revisited wartime and post-war events with fresh evidence. Courts annulled unjust sentences handed down in the years of consolidation. In these moments, the underground re-entered Poland's public life, not as an idealized myth, but as a complicated, human story, marked by conviction, tragedy, courage, missteps, and the harshness of geopolitical realities. Rehabilitation, however, did not bring harmony. The decades of silence and competing narratives had created deep divides in how Poles interpreted the legacy of both the AK and the state that suppressed it. Some emphasized heroism and martyrdom, others pointed to controversial actions by certain units. Still, others warned that the past was being used for present political agendas. Meanwhile, diplomatic tensions between Poland and Russia made the interpretation of wartime memory a matter of international dispute. Questions about numbers, motivations, and individual responsibility resurfaced with each new publication or commemoration. Yet, despite these disagreements, one truth became clear. The long shadow cast by the NKVD's confrontation with the Home Army extended far beyond the arrests, the trials, and the forest skirmishes. It reached into how Poland taught its children about the war, how families remembered lost relatives, and how the nation defined its path through a century marked by occupation, resilience, and contested liberation. As Poland moved into the post-Cold War era, the story of the Home Army and its struggle with Soviet power remained a source of unresolved emotion, a reminder that victory in 1945 had carried a price, and that the line between liberator and oppressor could shift with circumstance. It was a history built not only from battles and decrees, but from silence, survival, and the persistent weight of choices made in the shadows of shifting empires. And even decades later, as the last witnesses faded and debates continued, the question lingered. In a time when the future of the nation hung in the balance, who had preserved its dignity and who had tried to erase it? If this story helped you understand how disputed liberation shaped Poland's post-war fate, consider supporting the channel. Like, comment, and subscribe for more carefully told histories of the Second World War.